Welcome to History with Kevin. I'm Kevin. I'm not a historian and I'm not a teacher. I am, however, a storyteller, and I'd like to share with you a fascinating story in history. Let's take a journey together and explore a lesser-known historical figure. Have you ever heard of Cathy Freeman? Cathy Freeman is the first Aboriginal Australian to win gold at the Olympic Games. Let's go ahead and start at the beginning of her life. You see, Cathy was born in 1973 on February 16th to Norman Freeman, who was part of the Barraguba tribe, and Cecilia Barber, part of the Kuku-Yalanji. So she was Indigenous Australian. She had three brothers, Gavin, Garth, and Norman, and one sister, Anne-Marie. Unfortunately, her parents divorced in 1978. But Cathy was raised as part of the Baha'i religion, and the Baha'i religion very specifically teaches the essential worth of all. So the essential worth of all religions and the unity of all people. And these mindsets and beliefs, even though Cathy didn't stay strict to the religion as she grew up, she did follow these beliefs, and they did carry into her and instill in her some of the mindset that she carried further into her life. Cathy started showing a proclivity toward running, and her stepfather, Bruce Barber, began coaching her. Now, in her early years, she started showing amazing opportunity where she was winning races. Unfortunately, during those years, she also started experiencing racism where she was overlooked or wouldn't even be awarded, even if she won first, just because she was Indigenous. Despite this, Cathy continued running and continued pushing on. Okay, I need to interrupt myself here. You see, it's really important to know context. And the reality is that Cathy Freeman, during her racing times in the early 90s through 2003, unfortunately faced a lot of racism. And the context here starts back in 1788. You see, in 1788, English settlers settled in Australia. But it wasn't just any settlers. You see, they actually had 11 ships filled with convicts. And it was these convicts that were the initial English settlers in Australia. Then, over 100 years later, in 1898, 1899, and 1900, they were working on a constitution for what would then be considered the Commonwealth of Australia. Unfortunately, in 1901, when the Commonwealth officially formed, this constitution, the constitution itself was racist, purposely leaving out Indigenous people from being included in the census, along with several other aspects where essentially they gave rights to the states within the Commonwealth of Australia to be able to make rules on the different rights for Aboriginal Australians. This turned out to be a very poor and very bad idea because, unfortunately, a lot of these states made decisions to make it difficult for Aboriginals to get ahead in any way. When you fast forward in 1938, 150 years from the original settlers landing, there was a day of protest. But things didn't get better yet. And it wasn't until the 1950s, 1960s, during the Aboriginal, Australian, and Indigenous in general civil rights movement, it wasn't until then where there started to be a shift. And thankfully, thanks to some students who emphasized the living conditions and the education and different things that were missing, thankfully thanks to these as well as so many marches from the Indigenous people themselves, a change finally started happening. And in 1967, there was an amendment to the Constitution, finally righting the wrongs that they had made to Aboriginal Australians. Unfortunately, just as we know and as we've experienced in the U.S., just because laws have changed and rules have changed, this doesn't mean that racism just goes away. People still carried in their minds and in their hearts racist ideas and feelings, and that wasn't gone in the 1980s and 90s. You still had people who were Aboriginal Australians who struggled in order to make a difference, in order to persevere. And Cathy Freeman herself faced this. She faced it as a child when she didn't win awards, even though she was in first. She wasn't considered first place, and she faced it as she continued her career just in trying to represent her country with the Aboriginal flag. Cathy continued to be coached by her father through 1987, and for the next 2 years she had more professional coaching, and then in 1989, that's when she ran an extremely fast 100 meter. Let's take a look at those numbers. Looks like she ran the 100 meters in 11.67 seconds. This speed, along with the consistent winning that she was doing at the time, gave her the opportunity to represent her country in the women's 4x100 race during the Commonwealth Games in New Zealand. Now, this was a big deal because this was an opportunity for her to be one of the first, if not the first, representation for an Aboriginal Australian during the Commonwealth Games. Cathy and her team did very well. They ended up winning the 4x100 gold medal, allowing Cathy to be the first Aboriginal Australian to win gold at the Commonwealth Games. But she didn't stop there. In 1992, she proceeded to represent her country in the Barcelona Olympics. She was the first Aboriginal Australian to compete in the Olympics. She competed not only in the 4x100, but she also competed in the 400 meter race. She didn't place in either of those races, but this representation was amazing. Then came her breakout year, 1994. This was the Commonwealth Games now held in Canada, and in this she won gold in the 200 meter, the 400 meter, and silver in the 4x100. Her team would have won first and won gold in the 4x400, but due to an obstruction of the other team, they were ultimately disqualified. What an amazing year, though, to win so much. Unfortunately, it was covered with controversy. During this time, a man named Arthur Tunstall, he was actually upset because during the 400 meter gold that she received, Cathy Freeman ran around the tracks with both the Aboriginal flag and the Australian flag. And he threatened her to not run or not to do the same on the 200 meter run. He was trying to claim that because the Aboriginal flag was not a recognized country's flag, that her running with this was not allowed. The good news, very few people, at least in political stature at the time, agreed with him. Arthur went on to try to say, 60% of Australians agree with me. But what ended up happening is several people in politics at the time stood up and stood by Cathy Freeman's decision. Because when she won gold at the 200 meter, she ignored Arthur telling her not to carry the Aboriginal flag, and she ran with it anyway. After winning the gold and flying both the Aboriginal and Australian flags, it became a political hot topic. And you had Ray Godkin, who was president of the Australian Commonwealth Games Association. He simply said, I fail to see a problem with it. Many other politicians stepped up and agreed with him. But there was still that opposition from Arthur Tunstall. There was still opposition from other people. Cathy Freeman, however, used this opportunity. She didn't try to speak out. She wasn't trying to make a big statement in the public at the time. Instead, she simply let her friends know that this was how she was going to represent both her country and the fact that she was Indigenous. She did this to be an inspiration to other people. She didn't care at the time. It wasn't about the politics of it all. It was about being an inspiration to other Indigenous people in Australia. Cathy succeeded in this. Now, after her breakout year, Cathy continued to run very well. So much so that she was again invited to race in the 1996 Olympics, where she got the silver in the 400 meter race. The first Aboriginal Australian to win a medal in the Olympic Games. So in the 92, she was the first to represent her country, and in 96, the first to medal. You could tell she was on a trajectory. She didn't get gold, but she was almost there. In 1997, Cathy won the World Championships. She run it by running the 400 meters in 49.77 seconds. Unfortunately, she then injured her foot the next year, cutting her 97-98 season short. But she continued to train, and as soon as she was able, she came back with a flurry. In the 98-99 season, she didn't lose a single race that she was in. let's let that sink in for a moment. She ran for a living, which meant she ran as many races as the opportunities were available, and she didn't lose a single race during that season. During the 1999 as a whole, even though the seasons are broken up not directly by year, but during the 1999 year, she ended up with 13 wins, including the World Championship. That's amazing. Cathy Freeman was in the midst of so much success. Cathy Freeman left the 1999 season and came into 2000 favored to win in the 2000 Sydney Olympics. Now, this was significant for many reasons. One, once again, Cathy Freeman was representing her country as both an Australian and an Indigenous Australian. Two, Cathy Freeman was a now twice world champion in running and was able to represent her country while the Olympics were being held there in Sydney. What an awesome opportunity. Cathy's opportunity didn't stop there. She was told that she would have the chance to not just be a part of the torch relay, of the Olympic torch relay that year, but to be the final in the relay and to light the cauldron at the Sydney stadium. This was not something that she took lightly. It is something that she handled with pride, understanding the significance of the moment. All right, let's make one more interruption. I'm going to get out my handy-dandy History with Kevin notebook here, and we're going to go over some of the amazing things about the torch relay. Now, what happens is there's a fire lit in Greece, in Olympia. The fire is lit naturally, so they put it up to a certain type of bowl. They end up taking the torch, and the bowl is like this really cool mirror thing. Here, I'll put a picture up here in the corner, and they use this mirror in order to light the torch. Now, in the Sydney Olympics, what was really interesting about the lighting of the first torch is that it was a little bit too forecast that day, so the torch didn't actually light. What ended up happening is they had to use the flame from the previous day. But that didn't stop the amazing Olympic torch relay that occurred. You see, when it started off on May 10th, and 800 different people in the 2000 Sydney Olympics had the opportunity to run in Greece with the Olympic torch going all around Greece, finally making its way to Athens. From there, 1,500 people had the opportunity to take the torch through Oceania. Now, this is a huge thing. All right, so first of all, it was going island to island. And it touched Guam, Palau, Micronesia, Nauru, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, Samoa, American Samoa, the Cook Islands, Tonga, and even New Zealand. So all of these islands, people had the opportunity, 1,500 people to be exact, had the opportunity to carry the flames. One of the really cool things that happened, very special to these Olympics, is that because the coral reef is in that area, they actually set up and designed one of the torches to be able to go underwater. There was an individual who had the opportunity to take the Olympic torch and swim it by the Great Barrier Reef there. But of course, it didn't stop there. On June 8th, so this is almost a month after the relay started, it finally made its way to Australia. And from June 8th to September 15th, 11,000 people had the opportunity in Australia to carry the torch. This finally culminated in the torch making its way to the Olympic stadiums there in Sydney. Now, this is where I'm going to slow down a little bit on this story, because these Olympic Games were 100 years after the first women had the opportunity to participate in the Olympics. And so, once made it into the stadium, the 6 people who took the torch before Cathy Freeman were all previous female medalists, each one taking the torch in the relay with pride. When the torch finally got to Cathy Freeman, she accepted it at the bottom of the steps and turned. She had a big smile on her face, and then she solemnly looked up in the distance to the Olympic cauldron that was at the top. She made her way up the steps, and as she made her way to the top, there was a beautiful pool. In this pool, which I'll post here, there was a beautiful pool, and she got to stand in the middle of a circle, lit the flame, and the flames lit all around her in the pool. It then rose, the cauldron rose around her. Out right behind her, there was a little bit of a waterfall. As the cauldron lifted, it created somewhat of a waterfall effect falling around her. She then stood in front, turned around to look at the cauldron, and wait for its ascent to the top of the stadium. Now, I already mentioned that there was an issue at the beginning of the relay with the torch not lighting properly because of it being overcast. Well, there was also a little hiccup in this moment. You see, as soon as it lifted, the cauldron was supposed to make its way to the top of the stadium almost right away, but it didn't. There was a pause, and I think a lot of the onlookers at the time just assumed that it was part of what was going on. Cathy Freeman knew that it was supposed to go up right away, but she didn't waver. She stood holding the torch with pride, waiting for the mechanics and whoever were working on it to fix the problem. After what seemed like several minutes, the cauldron finally started raising, and Cathy Freeman got to see the cauldron that she lit, this opportunity that she had to represent her country and her people during the Sydney Olympics, and watch the flames as they went all the way to the top of the stadium. It was truly a majestic moment. After Cathy lit the cauldron at the Olympics, she didn't stop there. Cathy Freeman, 10 days later, had the opportunity to run in the finals. Now, to give a little bit of context there, you see, Cathy, in the 400 meters, in round one, she placed 5th out of 57 with a speed of 51.63 seconds. In round two, she placed 1st out of 32 with a speed of 50.31 seconds. In the semifinals, 1st out of 16, 50.01 seconds. And then, exactly 10 days after lighting the cauldron, Cathy Freeman placed 1st, winning gold in the 400-meter race, being the first Aboriginal Australian to win gold in the Olympics. She did so with the time of 49.11 seconds. And of course, she used this opportunity to continue to inspire others. Cathy Freeman decided that she was going to once again fly and run with her Australian flag and her Aboriginal flag. Now, why was this significant? Well, just as before when there was controversy in the 1994 Commonwealth Games, again, there was controversy here because according to the International Olympic Committee rules, it was a reach to represent flags that were not official country flags. You were not supposed to make a political statement. There was a possibility that because she chose to do this, there was a possibility her gold might be taken away. And she did it anyway. Cathy Freeman continued to run for the next 3 years and ended up retiring in 2003. After retiring, in 2007, Cathy formed the Cathy Freeman Foundation. And it had the very specific purpose of bridging the gap of Indigenous and non-Indigenous education in Australia. It has been an amazing opportunity for me personally to study through the life of Cathy Freeman, and I hope that you've been able to learn from this. Thanks for sticking with me and for learning a little bit of history from a storyteller. I hope you have a great day. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. And if you want to keep hearing history from a storyteller, consider subscribing and even hitting that bell for alerts each time that I post a video.